Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Sports Lock podcast. We are getting closer and closer to football season. The NFL season kicks off first week of September there, and right now we're starting at the beginning of July. We're going to be doing a divisional preview for all of the divisions, going over every team in the NFL, letting you know my fantasy predictions, my record predictions, just overall predictions for the team. We'll touch base a little bit on the draft of each player to each team, and we'll kind of go from there. I'll be doing rankings along with each team, and once we get done with the divisional previews, it'll be roughly close to kickoff of the NFL season, about a week or two before. I will have my rankings and predictions overall for you, so that way you're prepared for your fantasy football season. If you haven't watched this podcast yet, we do divisional previews and then weekly predictions in the NFL to prepare you for fantasy football mainly, but also to give some bets in there throughout the week. And we do odd and end things here on the podcast, such as Triple Crown previews for horse racing, March Madness previews, and so on. So if you're not already listening or following from past years, make sure you hit that follow button, that subscribe button. It helps me out. Find us on Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter at Sportslock Podcast. So let's get into it. We're going to start with the AFC North this week. Then we'll jump to South, West, and East. And then we'll go to the NFC and do the same North, South, East and West. And you will be able then to kind of predict when each division will be out. That way, if you're looking for a specific team, maybe you'll watch that week. But hopefully, you'll watch them all. So that's kind of a long intro. So let's jump into the action. And we're going to start with the Baltimore Ravens, who finished the season 10-7 last year. They were second in the division. They lost the division. They lost to the division winner, the Cincinnati Bengals, in the wild card round. It was a pretty close game, but Cincinnati came out on top. So what did they do this offseason to improve and some draft moves? Well, they signed their quarterback, Lamar Jackson, to a 5-year, $260 million deal. He is now the highest paid NFL player. They also signed wide receiver Odell Beckham Jr. to a 1-year deal up to $18 million. Odell didn't play the year prior, but he gets a contract this year to help out that wide receiver core in Baltimore, as well as another wide receiver they added was former Patriot Nelson Agholor, 1-year, $3.25 million deal. Now, on the draft, again, they're hitting hard with the wide receivers. Some say that that's where they were weak, and I believe so. Had one of the weakest wide receiver cores in the NFL, and they really are improving on it this offseason. Drafting in the first round with 22nd pick overall, wide receiver Zay Flowers out of Boston College. 78 receptions, over 1,000 yards, and 12 touchdowns last year. And they also went linebacker with their next pick, Trenton Simpson from Clemson, 20% completion rate allowed in his senior season. So that helps them on the defensive side of things. So let's move to their now highest paid player in the NFL, quarterback Lamar Jackson. Jackson finished quarterback 13 in fantasy last year with 17 touchdowns and 7 interceptions in 12 games. Of course, he battled some injury there, which he's been riddled with the last few years, which has kind of hurt him. He played just in 12 games in both 2021 and 2022, to be exact. He had 1 more touchdown in 2022 and 6 less interceptions, but he was down in passing yards by 640 and 43 less completions. Now, Lamar had the second most rushing yards for a quarterback last year, and that was again only in those 12 games, and he had 3 touchdowns added. This season, the report, though, is that he will try to be throwing the ball more and run the ball less. And they got him the wide receiver core that should help him be able to do that. So, in my opinion, if Lamar is healthy, I think that he will be around quarterback 5, which if we take his numbers from last season and we take that through to 17 games, he would have finished around quarterback 5. So my prediction for Lamar this year is that it's a risky play, right? The last 2 seasons, he's played only 12 games each season. So you're missing out on a full healthy season of Lamar. Does he get that there this year? I think it's a little less risky than last year, just because he's got the wide receiver core, and again, reportedly going to rush the ball a lot less. So he shouldn't be scrambling as much, and the odds of him getting hurt will go down a little bit. But you add this wide receiver core. I'm still comfortable taking him as my QB5, which is where he should be last year. And when you take a look at all the quarterbacks, Lamar is just a talent. It just sucks with his injuries that's where he's gotten. But I think good value would be right at QB5 for Lamar Jackson. And another great running back in the NFL, just unfortunately suffered injuries, is J.K. Dobbins, who had another rough season last year coming off his ACL, MCL injury in 2021. Dobbins was then riddled again by injury in 2022. He only played in 8 games, which again just really sucks. He had only 3 total touchdowns with 92 attempts for 520 yards. So, I mean, he was on pace to have 1,000-yard season if we take a look at that, and the touchdowns were there. So when you look at that, you're like, that can be promising. But you really got to value him at his ADP, which right now is about running back 22. I have him at my running back 26 right now. If we take again what he did last year and we throw it into this year, he's probably right around that RB 25 and 26. So ESPN's a little bit more optimistic on J.K. Dobbins this season. But again, with the injury concerns the last 2 years, it's just a little concerning to take him a lot higher, but he could definitely be a sleeper candidate for this season, just based off of Lamar not running the ball as much. Our wide receivers are Rashad Bateman, Odell Beckham Jr., and Zay Flowers are the main guys there. Bateman played in only 6 games with 285 yards and 2 touchdowns, so not a big sample size from Rashad from last season. Flowers, of course, a rookie coming in, and Odell Beckham Jr. didn't play last year. So it's really hard to determine how they will do in 2023 and who will be Lamar's favorite target. If you go by name, you would think it'd be Odell Beckham Jr., but Bateman's the only guy he's really had a connection with, and Zay Flowers being the rookie. So I would wait until after the preseason's over with to see who he connects with, who does well, and then maybe do your predictions off that. Right now, ESPN is having OBJ go wide receiver 44, Flowers 55, and Bateman 68. It could be a lot higher, a lot lower. Those guys could flop around by the time you draft come, the week before the season starts. So that's going to just vary throughout many drafts. And as the preseason and training camps go along, those numbers will change. So I'm really not going to give a prediction right now. I don't know if there'll be a clear-cut favorite to go off of. So maybe in a later round, you might snag a guy, but I feel like they'll kind of all be pretty even, and not one will just be a huge standout. The standout, of course, is their tight end, Mark Andrews, who went down from 2021 to 2022. He had 515 less yards, 34 less receptions, and 4 less touchdowns, and he still finished as tight end 4. Last year, I believe I had him at my tight end 2, which a lot of people did as well, with Kelsey number 1. But for this season, even with those same numbers this year, which I do see some improvement, jumping back to Baltimore going to be throwing the ball a little bit more from reports, I still have him tight end 2, which is where he's being drafted. Him and Kelsey are the 2 safest tight ends to take, knowing that they'll still get the job done, and they'll still be top 5 tight ends as long as they stay healthy. So you're safe taking Mark Andrews. Defense, they're top 5. They're a good defense to draft. Now the pros are they upgraded their wide receiver core for Lamar. That helps out their whole offense. But the con is there's just so many injury concerns. Bateman last year, Lamar last year, J.K. Dobbins last year. Can they stay healthy? They're 10-17 or 10-17 with everybody being hurt. So they could extremely improve this season if everybody stays healthy. Last year, 10-7, that's what I projected. And I'm going to go 10-7 this year. I think their schedule is a little bit tough. And again, we just haven't seen a fully healthy Ravens team. So basing it off of that, I'm comfortable going 10-7. but I do think that's kind of their floor, and their ceiling could be really high, even potentially winning the division. But we'll jump now to the division winners, which are the Cincinnati Bengals, who won the AFC North with a 12-4 record last season. Cincinnati ended up losing to Kansas City in the AFC Championship with a chance to go back to the Super Bowl. Just a phenomenal team that they have there, and what a job they've been doing these last couple of seasons with Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase, and that offense. Some of their moves, nothing too major, but they have a backup quarterback now in Trevor Siemian to a one-year, $1 million deal. And they add tight end Irv Smith Jr. to a one-year, $1.75 million deal, who will jump into their starting role from Minnesota. In the draft, they went defensive end Myles Murphy from Clemson in the first round, and they went with cornerback DJ Turner the second out of Michigan in the second round. Now, they've really focused on defense here, which is what I feel like they needed to do. Obviously, that offense is phenomenal. Improve the defense as much as possible, and that's what they did in this draft, so I like what they did there. Now we'll go to young Joe Burrow here, who had another incredible year. He finished as quarterback 4 in fantasy with 4,475 yards, which ranked 4th amongst quarterbacks last season. 35 touchdowns, which was tied for second amongst quarterbacks, and 12 interceptions. Burrow also added 5 rushing touchdowns, which was a career high so far. Now you take a look at this offense. Like I said, there's really nothing changing. So there really shouldn't be anything that says Joe Burrow does worse from last season. Sometimes people go down, but barring no injury, I think he's right around that quarterback 4 number. So I do have him one spot ahead of Lamar Jackson at QB4, and I think that's where he will go. I think arguably you have Jalen Hurts after last season a little bit ahead of him with his rushing ability as well. And then you jump to, of course, the top 2, Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen. I don't think anybody's going to argue anything there. Let's jump to running back Joe Mixon. Now, Joe Mixon finished running back 10 last season with 814 yards and 7 touchdowns. He did have a career high 60 receptions, which was 4th best amongst running backs, and 441 receiving yards, which was 5th best, with 2 receiving touchdowns. Now, my prediction for Mixon this season is he's going into his 7th season, has just been very consistent. They did draft running back Chase Brown from Illinois this past draft, and I don't think he'll cut into a lot of the work, but he'll definitely be a 3rd down back. I do see Mixon's receiving stats going down a little bit. I mean, that was a career high of 60, so I think it drops just down a tad bit more, maybe to around 50. So last year was RB10. I have him right around RB12 for me. A solid running back pick. There's a lot of good running backs in the top 15 that are going to be consistent. But Joe Mixon, I think, kind of hit a ceiling last year. And again, going into his 7th season, I see that it might just go down a tick. So that's where I would take him. Now to arguably the best wide receiver core in the whole NFL, you have Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, and Tyler Boyd. Now, Chase finished as wide receiver 11 last year in only 12 games. Obviously, had injury concerns. In his 12 games, though, he already had 6 more receptions than the year prior. And if he was healthy, he was on pace for 122 receptions, almost 1,500 yards, and 11 touchdowns, which had put him at wide receiver 4 last season. Now, T. Higgins finished wide receiver 19 with 74 receptions, 1,029 yards, and 7 touchdowns. I'd expect right around the same with him this season, but of course, he played a little bit longer than Chase did, so he did see more receptions there, which would have gone split between Chase in those last 5 games. Now, Tyler Boyd finished wide receiver 38, 58 receptions, 762 yards, and 5 touchdowns. So with some wide receiver additions in the draft, they did jump to that. So they are just kind of adding some depth to that wide receiver core. I do see Boyd's numbers slightly decreasing, but Higgins and Chase, of course, are the top 2 options. I think they stay solid. I have Chase wide receiver 4 and Higgins wide receiver 15. If you compare to ESPN, they have Chase wide receiver 3 and Higgins wide receiver 13. So right around the same area. I'm a little bit lower on Higgins this season, just because, again, I think those receptions went to him over Chase when he was injured, and with some more wide receiver additions, I don't know if they'll target him as much, but he'll still be a solid right around top 15 option. Finally, we talk about their new addition, Irv Smith Jr. from the Minnesota Vikings, where he played his last 3 seasons. He only played in only 8 games last season. For this year, I think you should see somewhere around 35 receptions, 300 yards, and 4 touchdowns, which is why I have him as my tight end 25, ESPN at tight end 24. Now, the defense was average last year. They should slightly improve with their draft picks, so that really helps. Some pros is that this team is keeping the same offensive core, which will just help them continue to dominate in the AFC North and in the AFC in general. Some cons, though, is that can the defense improve enough to get them back to the Super Bowl? So, again, it's not the offense. Is that defense going to be able to improve? Last year, they went 12-4. I predicted 12-4. This year, we're sticking at 12-4. I think, again, there's really nothing that's changing. So barring any injury, I think that they'll go 12-4. Third, we jump to the Cleveland Browns, who finished 7-10 and last in the division last season. But they're looking to improve this season, especially with Deshaun Watson. He only got a couple games under his belt last year due to the suspension. This year, he'll get to start fresh, which should be able to help Cleveland out, at least try to not do as bad. Now, some offseason and draft moves. They did get Elijah Moore from the Jets in a trade, which helps their wide receiver core. And they also signed former Seahawk wide receiver Marquise Goodwin to a 1-year, $1.75 million deal. And in the draft, nothing fancy, but they went defensive heavy. Now, quarterback Deshaun Watson, again, only played in 6 games due to that suspension, but he was still able to rack up over 1,000 passing yards, 7 touchdowns, and 5 interceptions. He also ran for a touchdown and 175 yards. Now, if he played the whole year, Watson was on track to finish right around quarterback 12. Now, this season, of course, he gets a full year to try to get himself back to who he was in Houston. So I have him as QB 11, a little bit lower than ESPN does. They have him at QB 8. He definitely has a lot of upside this season, but I'm going to be a little bit more cautious on him just based off his numbers last season and just trying to get reacclimated into a full season playing with the Browns. So, again, just a little bit lower, but I see somewhere around 20 touchdowns, 10 interceptions, and he'll add some rushing yards and touchdowns to that as well. Now, Nick Chubb was a huge sleeper of mine last year. If you watched my TikToks, if you watched my podcast, I was high on Nick Chubb because ESPN was undervaluing him tremendously. He finished RB6 last season, which was career high in yards, 1,525, which was third best amongst running backs. And he had a career high 12 touchdowns, which was also tied for third in the NFL. Chubb also carried the ball a career 302 times. Now, there's optimism this year with Kareem Hunt gone that Chubb will obviously be the main guy. However, I take into consideration Watson going to be running the ball a lot. I know that they're a run-first team, so they're going to let Chubb run, but Watson is also going to try to run the ball as well. Chubb had only 1 game over 100 yards, and he had no touchdowns with Watson as the quarterback too, which is very concerning when you take a look at those numbers. Started off the season hot without Watson, struggled at the end of the season with Watson, which if you're going into your fantasy championships and playoffs, that really didn't help. This year, I'm projecting him for about 1,250 yards instead of the 1,500 career high, and around 8 to 9 touchdowns, which would put him at RB12. Again, ESPN's a lot higher on him at RB8, but with little to no PPR upside, I'm comfortable putting him at RB12. Now, the wide receivers are interesting. You have Amari Cooper, you have newly added Elijah Moore from the Jets, and Donovan Peoples-Jones. Now, Amari Cooper was another sleeper last season, and I got him for $2 cheap in an auction league, and he was one of my stars last season. He finished wide receiver 10 with 78 receptions, 1,160 yards, and 9 touchdowns, which was tied for third amongst wide receivers. Now with Watson, all right, I'm back here. Anyways, with Watson, 5 receptions, 72 yards. Without Watson, or I'm sorry, with Watson, he had averaged 61 yards and 4 receptions. Without Watson, he averaged 1 more reception and about 11 more yards per game. I think Cooper remains around the same as last year, and I think he improves with Watson. Obviously, we had that small sample size at the end of the season. Elijah Moore was added, so it's tough to really say how he'll improve into the offense without seeing training camp and obviously the preseason. Donovan Peoples-Jones had 61 receptions for 839 yards and 3 touchdowns last season. With Watson, he averaged 41 yards and 3 receptions. Without Watson, he averaged 1 more reception and about 12 more yards. So again, kind of the same outcome with Cooper and Peoples-Jones, that they both did better without Watson. But again, not much time under his belt was Deshaun Watson in Cleveland. So this season going into it, it's tough to say how they will do. I think they'll do about the same, if not better, though, because finally they have a quarterback in Cleveland. So how many receptions will Elijah Moore pull from Amari Cooper? I think that's a big question when we're trying to rank him for an ADP. I have Cooper wide receiver 14. I'm a little bit higher on him than ESPN that has him at wide receiver 16. So a little drop from last season, but still a solid option. Moore right now is going wide receiver 61. I have him 3 spots higher at 58. And we take a look at Donovan Peoples-Jones. Right now, ESPN at 73. I have him a little bit higher at wide receiver 69. Now, the tight end is David Njoku, who finished tight end 11 last season with 58 receptions, 628 yards, and 4 touchdowns. With Watson, Njoku averaged 3 receptions and 33 yards, and without, he did a lot better. He had 2 more receptions and almost 20 more yards than without Watson. So definitely that was somebody that did worse with Watson. So what will he do this season? I think he will finish just outside the top 10 in fantasy, right around the top 10. He could be in it, maybe tight end 9, but I'm comfortably putting him at tight end 10, which is where ESPN has him right now. Now, the defense for the Browns is just like the Bengals. They're looking to improve from the draft. They draft defensive heavy, so that's where they're looking at. And I think the pro is Watson is the best quarterback that the Browns have had in a long time. And now that he can play a full season, I think that extremely helps out that team and that offense. And the cons are the same as the Bengals. Can the defense improve enough to win the Browns some games? We'll find out. Last year, 7-10. I projected 6-11, so 1 game worse. This year I'm going 6-11. And again, that's more of like a floor. I think they can improve a lot better than that with the team that they have. But with their schedule where they're at, I feel more comfortable putting them at 6-11 again. Finally, we have the Pittsburgh Steelers, who is the team that I root for, and I've been a long time Pittsburgh Steelers fan. And of course, living close to Pittsburgh, that's the reason why. The Steelers finished 3rd in the division at 9-8 last season. This was their 2nd worst record since 2013. So that's not really promising, but they had a lot of young new additions, and they just continue to build around their young core, and hopefully they'll be able to make the playoffs this season. Now, they did trade for Allen Robinson, which I really liked that trade. They got a great deal for him. They drafted tight end Darnell Washington from Georgia in the 3rd round, which adds a body to the line, but otherwise I didn't think it was a phenomenal pick. But they did use picks to upgrade their lines, and they had one of their best underrated drafts in a long time because of that. That is where they struggled on the offensive defensive line. That's where they needed to address, and that's in fact what the Steelers did. So now we have quarterback Kenny Pickett coming into his sophomore season. He finished with 2,400 yards, 7 touchdowns, and 9 interceptions in 12 games started. Out of the 12 games started, Pickett only had 5 games with more touchdowns than interceptions, which is very concerning, but he did kind of finish the end on a stronger note. And he never had a multiple passing touchdown game, so I assume that'll come this season. That offense was atrocious last season. I don't think it can get any worse. Pickett will improve this season tremendously, and I think he can finish close to the top 10 at a high. However, I'm going to put him at quarterback 17, and I think he could make for a solid backup. I think he's a guy that you can get at the end of a draft, and he could potentially fill in for injuries or, of course, bye weeks, or potentially jump into that starting role with that upside of possibly finishing close to the top 10. Running backs Najee Harris. Now, Najee had a small downgrade from his rookie to sophomore year. He had 166 less yards, but the big jump was shown in the receiving game, where he had 33 less receptions and 238 less yards. But even with that, he still finished RB13. Now, for this season, I think he easily has 1,000-yard rushing season. Again, an improvement in the line really helps Najee Harris the most. And I would hope that his receptions would slightly increase. That was a huge drop last season. That he was very impactful in the passing game. Of course, Roethlisberger towards the end of his career was just dumping the ball a lot with the poor offensive line and his age. So that is why the receptions were up. Last season, we expected them to go down. This season, I think they realized that they need to utilize him more in the passing game, and those receptions don't go up a lot, but maybe if he cuts in 10, 15 more, that'll really help him out. And in that case, I think that he'll finish at RB10. Right now, ESPN is at RB14. I'm a lot higher on Najee Harris than they are. But again, I think there's more optimism with the ability to upgrade that offensive line in the offseason in the draft. That it will help Najee just explode on this offense this season. Now, the wide receivers are Deontay Johnson, George Pickens, and Allen Robinson. Deontay Johnson had a decent year with receptions and receiving yards playing every game, but insanely enough, he did not record a touchdown. I didn't realize that till last season. I think he adds 5 touchdowns or so to boost his fantasy numbers this season, of course, and he still finished as wide receiver 28 last season without a touchdown. Now, George Pickens scored 4 touchdowns in his rookie season, adding 52 receptions for 801 yards. Well, he should see similar receptions, if not more, this season, and I think he can be a 1,000-yard receiving guy. Finally, they had Allen Robinson, who only played in 10 games for the Rams last year. He had 3 touchdowns and 339 yards on 33 receptions, but we know how talented of a guy Allen Robinson is. We've seen it in Chicago when he went down to Jacksonville. So if Pickett and him can gain a connection, I think that something could be special there. Now, it's, again, very hard to determine where Pickett's going to go. Is he going to spread the ball around a lot? Is he going to target Deontay Johnson or George Pickens more? It's very tough to say until we get to the preseason. But currently, Deontay Johnson is right now the lead guy taken from fantasy drafts at wide receiver 22. I'm sorry, I have him at wide receiver 22. ESPN has him at wide receiver 21. They have Pickens at wide receiver 40. I have him at wide receiver 36. And a really big sleeper, very, very deep drafts, and somebody that could be a solid waiver wire lookup or a dollar pick in an auction league would be Allen Robinson, where currently they have him as wide receiver 89. I think that's extremely low for him. So I'm going to move him to wide receiver 64. Now, tight end Pat Freiermuth was a big part of the offense last season. He finished as tight end 7 in fantasy with 63 receptions, 732 yards, and 2 touchdowns. For this season, I think he puts around the same numbers up, but he'll have a touchdown or 2 more. I have him as tight end 7 again this year, ESPN tight end 8. Still a solid guy to grab in your drafts as a tight end. If you're not one to grab one of the top guys, such as a Kelsey or an Andrews, wait, get some running backs, get some wide receivers in those rounds, knowing that a guy like Freiermuth and David Njoku will be sitting there a little bit later. Now, the defense wasn't bad last year, but as far as fantasy numbers, they weren't the best, so they should improve this year with offseason additions from the draft. Some pros are that the Steelers had an amazing draft to help the offensive defensive lines where they struggled, and you have a young core that's looking to improve on another season. The cons are, though, that it is a very young team, and will they be able to get enough wins to get to the playoffs? I think they just missed once again. Last year they were 9-8. I projected 8-9. This year I see them around 9-8 or 10-7, leaning more towards 9-8. Now, something I didn't do last season when I did my divisional previews, but I'm going to do it this season, is do the best lineup out of the AFC North, the best sleepers and the best bust. Now, again, this is just basing off of the division, so this isn't for the whole entire league. I will do those at the end of the season in a special podcast. But the best lineup would be Joe Burrow of Cincinnati, Najee Harris of Pittsburgh, Jamar Chase of Cincinnati, and tight end Pat Freiermuth from Pittsburgh. So it's the Cincinnati and Pittsburgh guys there. Some sleepers would be Kenny Pickett. Of course, Pickett is right now going around QB 19. But I think he improves off of last season, of course, and gets somewhere a little bit higher than that. Najee Harris, again, is another sleeper because I believe that he will improve in the receiving game and still have those rushing numbers that will improve, which will, again, push him a little bit higher. ESPN has him at running back 14. I have him at running back 10. Allen Robinson, I just talked about, is another sleeper to watch out for. And tight end David Njoku, if we're looking at the tight ends, I just think that he has the most upside to really pop off. In bust, if we have to look at all the quarterbacks, I have to say Deshaun Watson is a bust. If we're basing it off of his numbers last year, how he did to end the season, I know it's not going to be that bad, but they have him at QB8, which I think is just a little bit too high, basing off his only couple games last season. Running back Nick Chubb is a bust for me in the AFC North. If we take a look at all the running backs, just because he had career highs in rushing yards and he's not a receiving guy, and you bring in a quarterback that runs the ball more, and that Chubb had 0 touchdowns and only one game over 100 yards when Watson was playing. So I think that is not really good. Again, Chubb running back 8 for the Browns this season. I have him at running back 12. Wide receiver T. Higgins, I think, would be a solid wide receiver bust just based off of the additions of the wide receiver core. And as I discussed, Chase only playing in 12 games gave more opportunity to Higgins that would have went to Chase. So I think it is ADP. Not that it's going to be a big bust, but I think he'll be a few spots lower than what ESPN has him. And finally, Irv Smith Jr. for Cincinnati. I just don't see him playing a big role as a tight end in the offense. And if you think about Cincinnati in the last years, they really haven't utilized a tight end. And finally, again, if we take a look at the standings, I think the Bengals are first at 12-4, the Ravens second at 10-7, the Steelers third at 9-8, and the Browns fourth at 6-11. That's the podcast for you. We are done with our first divisional preview. Next week, or I should say this coming week coming up, I'm going to have 2 specials. It's either going to be every Tuesday or Wednesday that I'll be putting out videos for you guys. So make sure you follow me on Instagram, Twitter, and on TikTok to get those updates at Sports Lock Podcast. And make sure to subscribe on YouTube and share to anybody that watches fantasy football. I do the studying for you, so all you have to do is turn this on, listen to it. Let me help you win your drafts. I'm very experienced in every kind of fantasy football draft. I do them all: auction, PPR, non-PPR, keeper leagues, you name it. If you have any questions each week too, I go on TikTok and do a live on my Sports Lock podcast to answer your viewer questions or any questions that come up based off of start sit, or maybe, since it's still early on, predictions for the season or where you would take guys at their ADP in fantasy. So that's what I got for you this week. Again, make sure to check out the AFC South podcast coming out to you here in this next week. And I hope you guys enjoy your 4th of July, and I'll see you guys later.